In the heart of the 1700s, Paris was not just a city, but the intellectual capital of the entire world. It was a sprawling metropolis of 600,000 souls, each playing a part in a grand, chaotic drama. From the marble halls of the elite to the muddy alleys of the poor, the city pulsed with an energy that felt both revolutionary and fragile. The Enlightenment was the guiding light of this era, a movement that sought to replace superstition with reason and tyranny with law. Great thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau gathered in salons, their voices echoing through the cobblestone streets. They questioned why kings ruled by divine right and why the many should suffer for the luxury of the few. Yet this brilliance was a thin veil stretched over a fractured society. While the intellect of Paris reached for the stars, its body was mired in the structures of the past. The city was a living contradiction, a place where the future was being imagined by people who were still physically trapped in a medieval world. The contrast between the classes was not just a matter of wealth, but a matter of survival. The aristocracy lived in a world of symmetrical gardens and silken robes, insulated from the harsh realities of the street. For them, Paris was a playground of art, music, and refined conversation that lasted deep into the night. Just blocks away, the majority of the population lived in conditions that defied description. Overcrowded tenement buildings leaned over narrow streets, blocking out the sun and trapping the heat of the summer. In these cramped quarters, disease was a constant companion, and the hope for a better life was a luxury few could afford. The physical divide of the city reflected the spiritual divide of the nation. Elegant facades hid the rot of poverty, and the silence of the elite ignored the growing murmurs of the hungry. It was a tension that built slowly, like the pressure of a rising tide against a crumbling levee.
Be quiet now.
At the center of it all flowed the Seine, the silver ribbon that gave Paris its life and its purpose. It was the city's greatest commercial artery, a highway of water that brought grain from the fields and coal from the mines. Thousands of laborers spent their lives on its banks, hauling the heavy burdens that kept the engines of the city turning. But the Seine was also a source of profound misery. It was the city's primary drain, receiving the waste of hundreds of thousands of people and the toxic runoff of primitive industries. Despite this, it remained the main source of drinking water for the poor, who had no choice but to consume the very filth they produced. The river was a mirror of the city's dual nature. It was beautiful from a distance, reflecting the lights of the palaces and the arches of the bridges. Up close, however, it was a sight of struggle and sickness, a constant reminder of the high cost of urban life in a pre-industrial age. Rising above the chaos of the city was the majestic silhouette of Notre-Dame Cathedral. In the 1700s, it stood as the geographic and spiritual anchor of Paris, a monument of stone that had witnessed centuries of human history. Its towers were a landmark for every traveler and a symbol of an order that seemed eternal.
The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women.
Give us this day our
The environment immediately surrounding the cathedral was far from heavenly. The medieval core of the city was a labyrinth of dark, filth-clotted streets that pressed against the sacred walls. To enter the cathedral was to step out of a world of grime and into a world of incense and soaring arches, providing a rare moment of peace for the weary. Despite the crushing density of its surroundings, Notre-Dame was one of the few places where all of Paris met. The king and the beggar both knelt on the same cold stones, united by a faith that was the only common language they possessed. It was a unifying force in a city that was rapidly tearing itself apart at the seams. Scattered throughout the city were the great palaces of the nobility, such as the Hôtel de Soissons, standing like fortresses of refinement. These mansions were surrounded by private gardens where the air was sweet and the noise of the city was muffled. They represented the pinnacle of French architectural achievement and the ultimate expression of elite power. The transition from these estates to the public street was often jarring and immediate. A single wall could separate a meticulously pruned rose garden from a market reeking of decaying meat and human waste. This physical proximity without social interaction created a unique kind of resentment among the urban poor. Many of these grand structures did not survive the storms of history. They were symbols of a regime that would eventually be declared an enemy of the people, and many were dismantled stone by stone. Their disappearance reflects the fleeting nature of power when it is disconnected from the needs of the governed. In the northern part of the city, the Temple district offered a strange glimpse into a different kind of authority. Originally the fortified home of the Knights Templar, it had become a semi-autonomous enclave within Paris. It was a place where the king's laws did not always apply, making it a haven for debtors and craftsmen seeking to avoid taxes.
I believe the stakes need adjustment. 500 more.
This protected status gave the temple a unique character, blending the atmosphere of a medieval fortress with a bustling commercial hub. It was a city within a city, populated by a mix of highborn residents and hard-working artisans. Its thick walls provided a sense of security that was increasingly rare in the rest of Paris. However, the temple would ultimately become famous for a much darker reason. During the Revolution, it served as the final prison for King Louis XVI and his family. The very walls that once represented ancient privilege became the cage for the monarchy's final days before the complex was eventually razed by Napoleon.
Nonsense, it was clearly the king's architect. And look at
Life in Paris was not solely defined by hardship. It was also a city of spectacular entertainment. Seasonal fairs, like the Foire Saint-Germain, were the ancestors of the modern shopping mall and the theme park. For a few weeks each year, massive wooden arcades were built to host a dizzying array of goods and performances.
Silk will serve better for the portrait.
Indeed, Master Thorn, it is freshly pressed.
These fairs were rare spaces where the rigid social hierarchies of the time began to blur. A wealthy merchant might rub shoulders with a street performer, and an aristocrat might find themselves captivated by a puppet show alongside a common laborer. It was a world of consumption and spectacle, where the new wealth of the middle class was on full display. The fairs foreshadowed the modern era, where identity is often defined by what we buy and how we are entertained. They provided a temporary escape from the grim realities of urban life, offering a dream of luxury and excitement to anyone with a few coins to spend. Yet, like the old regime itself, these fairs were transient, eventually giving way to permanent districts of commerce. While Paris was the heart of France, Versailles was its soul, or perhaps its shadow. Located about 12 miles outside the city, the palace was a masterpiece of absolute power. Every fountain, every statue, and every ritualized movement of the court was designed to remind the world that the king was the center of the universe. The isolation of Versailles was both its greatest strength and its fatal flaw. By moving the seat of power away from the crowded streets of Paris, the monarchy lost touch with the pulse of the people. The court became a gilded cage, where the nobility competed for the king's favor, while the nation moved toward a breaking point. The cost of maintaining such a lifestyle was staggering, draining the royal treasury at a time when the country was drowning in debt. To the starving Parisian, Versailles was not a source of pride, but a symbol of a government that cared more for its gardens than its citizens. It became the ultimate target for the people's collective rage. Even as the political foundations began to shake, the state continued to invest in the pursuit of knowledge. Institutions like the Paris Observatory and Les Invalides were built to show that the French monarchy was a leader in science and social planning. These buildings were monuments to the idea of a rational, orderly state. The observatory represented the Enlightenment's desire to map the heavens and master the laws of nature. Meanwhile, Les Invalides was a pioneering effort to provide long-term care for disabled veterans, reflecting a growing sense of national responsibility. These were the seeds of the modern state, planted in a time of deep social neglect. The contradiction was profound. A government that could track the stars and care for its soldiers could not find a way to feed its city. This gap between scientific advancement and social welfare is a theme that continues to haunt modern civilization. It reminds us that progress is hollow if it does not reach the most vulnerable members of society.
We must consider the philosophical implications before we
By the late 1780s, the contradictions of Paris could no longer be contained. A series of failed harvests led to a desperate shortage of bread, the staple of the Parisian diet. At the same time, the national debt had reached a catastrophic level, and the king's attempts to raise taxes were met with fierce resistance.
By the authority of the Republic, this tribunal declares you
The meeting of the Estates General in 1789 was supposed to be a solution, but it only exposed the deep divisions in French society. The commoners, representing the vast majority of the population, realized that the system was rigged against them. The political deadlock in the halls of power led to a direct explosion of anger in the streets. Violence began to flicker across the city like heat lightning before a storm. In the markets and the squares, the rhetoric of the Enlightenment was translated into the language of the hungry. The people were no longer asking for reform, they were demanding a total transformation of the world they lived in. The breaking point arrived in July of 1789. The destruction of the Saint-Lazare prison and the legendary storming of the Bastille were not just military actions, they were symbolic decapitations of the old order. The Bastille, a grim fortress that had stood for centuries, represented the king's arbitrary power to imprison anyone at will. When the walls of the Bastille fell, the spell of absolute monarchy was broken forever. The streets of Paris became a battlefield where the future of humanity was being contested in real time. The revolution brought a sense of liberation, but it also unleashed a wave of violence that would consume friend and foe alike. The physical landscape of the city was forever altered. Prisons were torn down, churches were repurposed, and the names of streets were changed to reflect the new values of the Republic. Paris was no longer a city of subjects, but a city of citizens, standing at the dawn of a terrifying and beautiful new age. The legacy of revolutionary Paris is the foundation of the world we live in today. The concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity were born in the blood and fire of those turbulent years. These ideas crossed oceans and mountains, inspiring people everywhere to claim their right to self-governance. We see the echoes of the 1700s in our modern debates about inequality and the role of the state. The ruins of the palaces and the stories of the street remind us that no system is permanent. History is not a straight line, but a cycle of growth, decay, and rebirth, driven by the eternal human desire for dignity. Paris transitioned from a medieval stronghold to the laboratory of modern democracy. It proved that ideas are the most powerful force in the world, capable of toppling thrones and rewriting the social contract. But it also warns us of the cost of ignoring the structural cracks in our own societies. As we look back on the history of Paris, the most important lesson we can draw is that the health of a society is measured by the gap between its highest ideals and its lowest realities. When the brilliance of the elite becomes a mask for the suffering of the many, the foundation of the state begins to rot. In our own lives, we must strive to ensure that our personal success does not come at the cost of our awareness of the world around us. If you were standing in the streets of Paris in 1789, would you have fought to preserve the stability of the past, or would you have risked everything for the uncertainty of the future? Share your thoughts in the comments below, as your perspective is what keeps this conversation alive.
We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters.
Thank you for spending this time with us in the shadows and the lights of history. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together through the stories that shaped our world.